Thank you to the Center for Fiction, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm Perri, and I am thrilled and honored to be moderating this conversation with two writers I admire tremendously about two really wonderful, exciting books. And I wanted to start, first of all, by saying, hello, I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad we get to talk. And I want to say that both of these books, reading them, and one quality they have in common is the feeling that it's almost an epistolary feeling. And one of them is called Letter to a Young Female Physician, in the sense that you're really writing it very directly to an audience. But Anita, also in your book, that it's being addressed very, very directly to the readers that you want to reach. And I was going to start out, I can start, Anita, by asking you, and then turn and ask Suzanne the same question. Talk about how you came to write this book and who the readers were you had in mind, and maybe a little bit also about the how of writing it.
Well, thank you. That's a lot of questions. It's great to be here with two women and two writers I respect a lot, I've known of and read for many years. Period, End of Sentence, the book was inspired by Period, End of Sentence, the documentary short, which won the Oscar for Best Documentary Short in 2019. I was watching the Oscars when they announced that this was the winner, and I literally jumped off the couch and pumped my fist. And the director said, "I can't believe a movie about periods just won an Oscar." So it was this moment of, I can't believe that we're actually talking about this out loud. They asked me, they came to me and asked me if I would be interested in writing a book inspired by, connected to the film, not about the film, and really not, it just takes off from there. And I said, yes, I have written about menstrual health and justice and injustice before. They asked me because I wrote The Red Tent, of course, not because of my editorials about menstruation, but because The Red Tent centers women's lives and women's health, and imagined, I made it up, that women joined together in biblical times, 2000 BCE, to menstruate together, where childbirth happened and all of that. So that's how they got to me. How I did this, I wrote this book during COVID. And so my ability to interview people in person, which I would have liked to do and do when I'm writing nonfiction, was very limited. I did get a bunch of phone calls in, but most of it was internet research, which is something I'd never leaned on that heavily before, but I certainly had international material in front of me every single day. So part of the how was getting a Google alert that said menstruation. And every single day I would get somewhere between 3 and 10 hits from different places around the world. Some of them were about the market and how the market was doing in menstrual products, but some of it was about women fighting for menstrual justice, stories, horror stories of women being, of suffering because of their periods. So that was a bit of the background and the how and the why.
Thank you. So Suzanne, let me turn to you to introduce your book. Again, I was really struck by this quality, and of course I am no longer a young female physician, but a sense that the book was being written very directly.
Yeah. So, first of all, I should say it's an incredible honor for me to be here with two of my writer heroes. I'm just absolutely pinching myself. This is amazing. And to return, at least virtually, to Brooklyn, where I was born and raised, it's just all too wonderful. Since you are both much more experienced book writers than I am, what I'm about to say, you'll probably say, yes, of course, that's the way it always is. But Letter to a Young Female Physician is not the book I intended to write. It's the book that found me. I was toiling away for a few years on a memoir about having missed the diagnosis of my own mother's myocardial infarction, culminating in her being wheeled into my own emergency room and being diagnosed by my colleagues. That story made its way into this book, but that's not what the book is. While I was procrastinating writing that book because it wasn't going well, there was a funny little moment that happened. It was late June of 2016, 30 years almost to the day of my starting my own internship. And I was asked to participate in an exercise as part of orientation for incoming medical interns at Mass General, where I work in primary care. And the exercise was write a letter to your future self. Your future self, in the case of the interns, being 6 months later, when they would all be piled off to Cape Cod for a weekend, and they would be handed back their letters and see how far they'd come in 6 months. I thought the whole thing sounded a little hokey, and I had to reschedule my vacation in order to participate, and I was in a very grumpy mood. And as I watched the interns writing these letters, particularly noticing that more than half of the interns around the table were women. Suddenly, I was really almost on the verge of tears. And I had been writing enough at this point to know that those moments of unexpected emotion and confusion um, are ripe for writing. And I had to write to find out what it was that was moving me so much about this. And what I started writing was a letter to myself 30 years earlier. And that letter became an essay in the New England Journal of Medicine. It is directed to a very specific person, and the person is my former self. It turns out that uh, in a way, this makes me very happy, but in a way, it makes me very sad that my concerns about sexism in medicine and about imposter syndrome seem to resonate thoroughly with young doctors today, and not just women, and actually not just doctors. That essay was picked up by lay outlets, interestingly enough. But anyway, I somehow bumped my head and realized I was writing the wrong book, and ended up writing this one. Um, one of the great pleasures of personal writing is you get to re-examine your own life, and you see themes that you didn't realize were there. And for me, a big theme was that, and the subtitle of it is Notes from a Medical Life, is that I really had lived a medical life. My father was a doctor. My husband's a doctor. I'm a doctor. I've been a patient. I've been the mother and daughter of patients. And medicine has really suffused my whole life, and particularly being a woman in medicine. And that was true from the very beginning of my life back in Brooklyn. So let me read you just, barely more than a paragraph about that. This is from chapter 1, which is called Risk Factors. In elementary school, my friend Lisa and I spent hours playing board games at her family's home or mine in the leafy Ditmas Park neighborhood of Brooklyn. Our favorite was Careers. Like Life, another game then popular, Careers aimed to instill in young baby boomers solid post-war American values. The goal was to select an occupation, doctor, lawyer, engineer, and so on, and accumulate victory points for fame, money, and happiness. Each player enjoyed distinct advantages, except the doctor. The only advantage to being the doctor was that you got to pretend you were a doctor. I always chose to be the doctor. It wasn't an obvious choice. My father was a doctor, and so were most of the men in the couples who made up my parents' social circle, but none of the women were, except one, a psychoanalyst who had practiced from her home in a wheelchair. She'd been paralyzed by spinal anesthetic while giving birth. Once, when I was about 14, I asked my mother whose fault it was that this woman was paralyzed. Was it the obstetricians, the anesthesiologists? My mother had just entered law school after years as a housewife and volunteer active in civic organizations, and I knew this was now the kind of thing that interested her. My mother said she supposed if you really thought about it, you could say her husband was to blame since he had impregnated her. The word impregnated sounded painful to me, like a punishment.
So thank you both so much. I was gonna scroll us, I was thinking a little in terms of structure, thinking back on some of the problems you raised. Suzanne, I'm going to come back to you and ask you to talk a little more about imposter syndrome and some of the other issues that you were looking back on that are and are not behind us now. But Anita, why don't I go back over to you? The first chapter of your book is called The Curse. And can you talk a little bit about menstruation in terms of stigma and shame and the cross-cultural persistence of stigma and shame? As you write, nobody is born with an innate sense of shame about menstruation, but it persists.
Yes, it does. There are a lot of curses in the world. You can have a curse that you have red hair. You have a curse that you get turned into a frog. But the curse is one and only thing, and that's menstruation. And there are supposedly 5,000 euphemisms for menstruation in the world. But the curse is one of the most familiar. It resonates across many cultures. It is baked into our societies, most of our societies, in religious traditions, in the legal system. It's based on misogyny and patriarchy, to name the two big elephants in the room. Women are less than, and one of the proofs that they are less than is because they bleed once a month. And this is seen as a curse, a problem, a punishment from God, and proof of inferiority. And we all grow up with this in one way or another. And a lot of it is communicated just through silence, through never talking about it, through whispering about it, for not having words to describe what's happening, not understanding what's happening in your own body. And the curse is actually literally a curse for a lot of people. There are people, there are women in the world, young girls in the world who start menstruating and think they're dying, think they have cancer, and don't tell anybody. And there are people in the world who suffer from enormous pain when they menstruate and are told that's what it's like, just grin and bear it, and are not diagnosed with various illnesses, including endometriosis, for years and years and years, including some doctors that I know. So it is a curse, both literally and metaphorically, but the curse really is shame rather than menstruation. And the shame that we have about our bodies and the lack of knowledge and the lack of language we have about our bodies are baked together into, that put us at risk. They put us at risk for our health, for our well-being, for our education, for our self-confidence. And my book is full of examples of that around the world. And it is a global problem. It's not just a problem of low-income countries. It's in your very own zip code, as I like to say. There are women and girls who are unable to take care of their menstrual needs because they can't afford it, because they're embarrassed. And there are places in the world where infection, because of menstruation and lack of ability to take care of yourself, lack of clean water, facilities, actually threatens health. And actually, there are two examples in the book of two young girls who committed suicide after being shamed in their classrooms by their teachers, by the way. And so while those are extreme cases, there are examples of what the curse that is shame does to people every day. It is an effective curse. So I just want to go back to a question I didn't answer at the beginning, which was, who did I write this book for? I wrote it for everybody. I wanted it to be a popular book. I wanted it to be readable by everybody. And I have to say, and I've gotten lovely responses from people. The most powerful ones are from a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old girl who read the book and got angry. And one of them, the 13-year-old said at the end, I had a fist bump and I knew I was going to get into the fray and make sure this doesn't happen in the future. So that's about the best compliment that a writer could have. It is not written for children. It is not a young adult book, but our youth, our 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds, many of them are very sophisticated about injustice in the world. And this injustice is very personal. I think anybody who's menstruated has the memory of panic, of not being able to take care of themselves, of being found out, of bleeding, of having an accident, and that being feeling like the end of the world. So we have to change that.
Well, you also tell some very wonderful stories of what you describe as quote unquote shamelessness.
Yes.
I wondered whether there was one or another that you'd particularly like to tell. I think I told you I had a personal favorite.
It's one of my personal favorites too. This is, and I found this on Twitter. Some girls, some middle school, junior high school girls somewhere in the Midwest, we really don't know where, they were very protected about where they were located, went to the principal of their school and said, we think there should be free period products in the bathroom. And he said, no, because it would be taken advantage of. And the girls, instead of, slinking away, went home and baked tampon-shaped cookies, including the string, including a splash of red food coloring. They looked very much like tampons. And they posted it on Twitter, and it got tremendous traction. And he was so embarrassed that, surprise, there are tampons in that bathroom and pads. Those girls didn't stop there. They actually had a website up for a short period of time. It got taken down too fast, and they called themselves the Revolutionary Girls Baking Society. And on it, they said they connected what they had done, not just for their own schools, but they connected it to larger issues of justice for girls and dignity for women and girls around their periods. And they said, you have to join us, and this is part of our mandate for the future. So that's one of my favorite stories about shamelessness. They're from all over the world. There was one more in India. There was a kerfuffle when a Hindu priest put up a sign in front of his temple that said women of menstruating age were not allowed inside the temple because they might pollute it. This caused at least one college student to start a Twitter feed that said #HappyToBleed. And it was picked up all over India, all over Southeast Asia. I saw people chimed in from Nepal and from Japan and from all over the place. And there was a 365-mile demonstration against this, this outrage of women protesting that that edict from this one Hindu priest. So there is growing shamelessness. One of my favorite things also is a t-shirt that says, "I'm bleeding, get over it."
So, Suzanne, can I come back then, still sort of things that should be bad old days but aren't? Can you talk about imposter syndrome, which you write about from, you do so much with that idea, and it sounds like it's resonated with so many people. Can you talk a little more about it? And
yes, and it's actually, as I'm sitting here thinking, it's not about it. It's not, and listening to Anita, it's not unrelated to what Anita is talking about, and I'll explain why. So imposter syndrome was first described in 1978 by some psychologists, and it was described as a perpetual feeling of intellectual inferiority held by certain high-achieving women. And it turns out that it's also prevalent in men. Now, when I first had imposter syndrome, I had never heard the term imposter syndrome. When I was in medical school, my best friend and I called ourselves the asterisks, as in we got into Johns Hopkins Medical School, asterisk, but there must have been not many applicants that year. And so I think the form imposter syndrome takes for a lot of people is every achievement you have, it was just luck, or it was a fluke, or if I only hang around long enough, they'll figure out what a phony I am. Yeah, I fooled some of them, but I won't fool all of them, and the bottom will fall out eventually. um, what's strange about it is that people like um, Serena Williams and Sonia Sotomayor and Meryl Streep have talked openly about their own imposter syndrome. And so if you really kind of pick at this, you got to say, all right, if Serena Williams is an imposter, then what does it mean not to be an imposter? Does it mean that we have to be perfect? So, so how does this relate to what Anita was just saying? I think, and I really learned this after the initial essay came out, and I got emails from all over the world. Some of the most heartbreaking ones were from women in medicine who are women of color, saying there is nothing I will ever be able to do or be, and nothing I will ever achieve that will make me feel like I belong here. When I'm standing around that bedside or sitting at that conference table, I will always feel like the one who is here on a fluke. And, I think the reason for that is that there's a lot of internalized sexism, racism, ableism, homophobia. So, so that uh, shame that Anita is talking about, which most girls begin to experience very early, and really, I think, emphasized at the onset of menstruation, of you're not quite okay. And then, oh my God, now you have hips, now you gained weight, now you're really not okay. And this sort of drip, drip, drip of you're not okay. Well, here you are, now you're at one of the best medical schools in the country, and you're calling yourself an asterisk. And, I'll just end by saying that I kind of wish that young women now, when I talked about this, said, I have no idea what you're talking about. That's like the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. Well, that's not what they say. What they say is, yes, that's exactly how I feel. So I think in terms of the shame and the drip, 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 and the internalized, bias that leads to imposter syndrome, I don't think we've made any progress at all. And in fact, some ways it's worse because social media makes us all feel like we're somehow missing the boat.
Let me just respond to that. I think exactly. And drip, drip, drip is a kind of a funny.
I was gonna
Or-
apologize for drip, drip, drip.
Actually, it's perfect, right?
I think it's right.
But but yes, and very young women, and I'm talking 13, 14, high school students and freshmen in college, are the most shameless that I see. And as bad as social media is, it has connected this movement around the world, and it has made a huge sisterhood, although that leaves out trans men who menstruate, but it is a large, people know what's going on in the rest of the world. And one of the great examples was this, a friend of mine's daughter came home from school and she said, why do I have to hide my pads? What is that? Why? And her mother said, well, nobody ever asked that question. And she said, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to walk around with my pad in my hand. It's like, unthinkable, right? Can you imagine being 14 or 15 and saying that out loud to your mother, and then going to, and I know this girl, and I know she did it when she went to school, and they inspire one another. This is not something you can do alone. We have a long way to go. I don't want to make it sound like, oh, it's wonderful and everything's fine, but the leadership of Gen Z, and even the statistics comparing millennials and Gen Z young women, Gen Z has a very different attitude even than their sisters who are just a few years older than them. And I kind of think it's part of the Greta, Malala, Emma, these wonderful one name, wonderful young women who are leading movements, and with apparent great confidence in their own ability to make a difference in the world. So that's my takeaway from all of this is hope. So.
Yeah, I'm absolutely hopeful. But I think, just to complicate matters, I think what I'm seeing in medicine is that even though there are now more female medical students than male medical students, it's still a completely from the top down, a completely male dominated field. And what I'm hearing a lot of is of young women in medicine feeling, as I did so many years ago, that somehow, they have to hide their light. They have to hide their resistance in order to, it's a real conflict in order to do this thing that they so want to do, that they so love. And as I say, it's heartbreaking to me that this is still the case. But in my extensive anecdotal experience, it still is the
It
case.
is the case. I remember, I felt like an imposter my entire career. It could be better. The research could have been better. The writing could have been better. I'm getting away with something. I don't think it goes away, and I'm not sure it gets erased, but I'm certainly with you. And I think it is one of those other unspoken curses that face women. And I think menstruation is just sort of part of that package. When you're having your period, and if you're not feeling well, for example, you're never allowed to let anybody know, right? You're never supposed to tell your boss. You're supposed to pretend that everything is the same every single day, that your body doesn't function any differently than men's. And it's also part of the whole larger notion that workers are widgets, and that we're all, you should fit into the box, and that men too have to fit into this box, whether or not they have obligations to take care of children at home too. They can't, that doesn't fit into the box. So women have to do this. And so we are denying ourselves all the time.
And this is so especially true in medicine, where the extra layer is that somehow to even have a body is to turn your attention away from your patients to yourself, which is why we are acculturated to work sick. Even Perri years ago actually wrote a wonderful essay about this, to work sick, even at the risk of infecting our own patients. I mean, how crazy is that?
Maybe that's finally changing, don't you think?
Well, I think COVID
COVID
put a little
has
bit of a dent in that for sure.
the idea that it's heroic to not tell people if you've got a fever, or you're, until you actually faint on rounds.
Yeah. Well, I actually, apropos of what you're saying, Anita, one of the, in my book, one of the unspoken rules of my residency, which I list, is, do not complain about anything, most especially menstrual cramps.
Yeah.
But here was the kicker, is that it was, because we loved it and we wanted to belong and we wanted to be part of it, which is why we bought into a system that in many ways was fundamentally hostile to us. It was a point of pride to be on call the first day of your period, because that
You're
meant
tough as any man, you're tougher than any man, right?
you were tougher. It's like the old Ginger Rogers. She did everything Fred Astaire did except backwards and in heels. Well, this was our version of it. We did everything the men did, except we did it with cramps.
And I'd like to talk one of the things I learned a lot writing this book was about medicine and menstruation, and the failures of medicine and menstruation, largely because most doctors are men, and men don't menstruate and don't ask about it either. And from what I understand, until maybe recently, menstruation wasn't part of the curriculum in medical school. Really, you weren't told to ask questions about a person's menstrual status the way you do about about your digestion. It's now being talked about as a vital sign, as another vital sign that needs to be discussed when you have somebody, especially a young person coming to you early in their menstrual career. And it's still not part of the general body of knowledge, I think, that's being passed along. And women and girls, put up with pain and doctors sort of expect them to put up with, actually, Dr. Jen Gunter, who's written a couple of books about menstrual health, tells a story about going to the doctor when she was young, having tremendous pain, and the doctor telling her, you know, Advil, go home. And this was a woman doctor. And she didn't blame the doctor because she knew what her medical training was like. So, and the notion of gaslighting people about their own symptoms and their illness, which of course happens with women of color so much more often, so much more often. It's the lack of trust in the medical system is, you know, based on something. And being told that your pain is in your head is pretty standard, especially for women and for women of color in particular.
Mhm. Well, I think we doctors tend to be most dismissive about things that make us feel most inadequate, which is why we do so badly with issues around weight. And
You've got an amazing chapter in your book about
issues around weight, issues around disease in which, disease and disability in which there is no firm diagnosis. That makes us nuts and makes us behave badly. And as far as menstruation goes, well, it was on the curriculum. This is the way it was taught. And I'm sure this was Perri's experience too. We memorized the graph of what hormones do during the month. This was a graph that didn't seem to have anything particularly to do with actual women, but there was a graph.
Yeah, LH, FSA, you know.
And then we learned about pathology, about things going terribly wrong, but about people going about their, it's quite analogous to how little we learned about nutrition, and it's still how little is still taught about nutrition. It's like, well, like the regular stuff, like ask your mother. It's something that we sort of push away. We don't know what to do with. I do think that's changing. Menopause used to be the same way as well. I wonder what weight, menstruation, and menopause all have in common. And undiagnosed chronic illness and disability.
Yes. Yes.
So, go on.
Patriarchy and misogyny. I mean, this is the world we live in. It doesn't have to be the world we live in. There are alternatives to this. There are.
So what I was going to say is that, one of the cases that you both make and that you're making again now has to do with the power of narrative and of, how much impact it can have to tell the stories which have not been told, to, look at what's really going on in the lives of people who are experiencing some of the things you've just been talking about, but also, Suzanne, to sort of look at some of the narratives that are going on in those exam rooms or in those call rooms and have not actually been discussed. And some of what you're saying about the reaction to these books speak to the power of bringing forward those narratives.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the great lessons learned in my book was finding indigenous cultures where menstruation is not a curse. In fact, that it's that menarche, the beginning of menstruation, is celebrated by the entire community. It's the proof that the tribe will continue, that human life will continue. And it's found in all kinds of corners of the world, including New Zealand, the Maori culture, the Hupa culture of Native Americans, of Native people in California, in Africa, and my favorite, the Bashali, which is the women's house of a small tribe of Hindus in northern Pakistan, which was actually is, I think, still actually very much like the Red Tent, a house where women would go and take off their heavy, beautiful headdresses and drink tea and take naps and talk to each other and give counsel to young women and gossip and relax. And the female anthropologist who was granted access to it said the best way I can describe it is as a slumber party during menstruation. And this particular one she was describing was in the center of the community. So everybody knew what they were doing and why they were there. And it was not considered dirty or foul. It was just part of life. And to know that this is possible also exposes the fact that these are mostly cultures where that are not where religion is not patriarchal, where the earth and the sky are part and parcel of one another. In the Maori tradition, there's a male who bleeds, and so it's a very different way of looking at the world, and it's really quite a corrective to thinking that it has to be this way, and it's always been this way, and it will always be this way. It doesn't have to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Suzanne, talk a little also, if you will, about narrative and about your own kind of experience turning to writing and to narrative and working with that in the medical world.
Yeah, so my very favorite topic. I mean, here's what's funny about the medical community, particularly doctors and nurses, I think. On the one hand, we're sort of people, and we're curious about other people, and we love to communicate. And we tend to be, I think, on average, pretty empathic. And we love stories. That's one of the main drivers, I think, into the profession. But on the other hand, we're all working in our own little rooms at furious paces. And because of time and issues around confidentiality, mostly we're not allowed to talk to each other. So having a chance to tell stories is just among healthcare workers is an extraordinary thing. A bulk of my work now at Mass General is using literature, reading and writing workshops to sort of open up, give permission to this kind of storytelling. And then magic really happens because we are just chock full of stories. We're also chock full of shame around our own failures, shame around our failures of empathy, because we're only human, shame about being human at all. And the antidote to shame is talking, is doing what we're doing now. That's the antidote to imposter syndrome. I mean, gee whiz, Anita, if you have imposter syndrome, I mean, there must not be a thing, right? I mean, it must not be real. It's just statistically impossible for us all to be frauds and for us all to have somehow faked out everybody for decades. In your case,
Just really good at it. We're just really good at it.
You are incredibly good. I mean,
we're all really good.
We're proud to be such good imposters.
I mean, you should have gotten that Oscar, honestly. Anyway,
I had nothing to do with the movie. Absolutely nothing.
Right.
This is there before me.
So what narrative storytelling is at the heart of medicine, and if you give caregivers permission to tell their stories, it's just extraordinarily healing. And one of the main ways in which it's healing is it reminds us that we're no different than our patients.
Yeah.
And
one of the stories, part of the stories in this book that I loved was men's stories. Men are the villains a lot in a lot of menstrual stories, but finding stories of men who behave beautifully as our models, and we have very few of those. So there was a cab driver in South Africa who was ferrying students to and from school, and he noticed bloody tissues on the back seat, and he realized these girls didn't have product. So what did he do? He didn't stop picking them up. He went and bought pads, and he put them on the dashboard, and he said, if you need them, take them. And when the boy started giving them grief about it, he said, stop it. It's normal. And he became a hero. He was on television. He was celebrated. But there are all the other stories about fathers who were taking care of their daughters when they had their periods, who weren't freaked out and were proud and pleased when their daughters felt that they could actually talk to them about it. One dad said, I've always told her she could come to me to talk about anything. And when she did come to talk to him about her period, he said, I guess it worked. She feels she can talk to me about that. there's wonderful stories, and there's videos, and there's examples of this which really need to be told, and those stories I think can go a long way in healing what's going on. Also sexual health education with all the genders in the same room, really important, so everyone has a vocabulary that they share, so that menstruation isn't what does that mean, says the little boy, and he knows from from 5th grade on. And she knows from the age of 5th grade on what a penis is. So it's, so if we have the language and you get rid of some of the secrecy and the shame, it gets better. But these stories are not told and the language is not shared. And as long as that happens, we have trouble.
So I just want to remind people who are participating that if you want to put questions in the Q&A, we'll start taking them. I do want to also come back and sort of ask a little about, righting the wrongs and creating the better world that, maybe Anita, if you would talk a little about the concept of menstrual justice, and we actually already have one question in the Q&A from someone who'd like you to talk about the special burden on low-income women in the US because SNAP benefits can't be used to purchase period products. But if you want to talk more generally also about the idea of menstrual justice and why it matters.
And it matters in so many dimensions. This is the perfect intersectional issue. So poverty, race, water, access to medical care, all of these things intersect in menstruation. And if you are on a very tight budget and you have to choose between buying food and buying enough period products for your family, you're going to buy food. And what that means is that if you have a kid who's menstruating and going to school, probably she is going to feel, with 2 pads for the day, is going to spend the entire day worrying about whether she's going to get caught. And that means her self-confidence is undermined. That means she's not going to try out for the speech team or the softball team. And so she's going to walk around all the time constricted. And in some parts of the world, girls stay home from school because they have no way to take care of their menstrual needs in school, and they fall behind, and sometimes, not so rarely, they drop out. So the impact of menstrual poverty in this case is profound. It can be profound and it can be subtle. And it's as I said, it's in your zip code as well. And then there's the whole tax structure that, as you mentioned, SNAP and food stamps have never covered period products or diapers, I think. And that means that you're paying taxes, you're paying what is essentially a luxury tax on an essential item. And in some states, in Louisiana, you don't pay sales tax on Mardi Gras beads, but you do pay sales tax on tampons, pads, and pads. So the structure of our tax system is also in this way. And for poor women and women incarcerated who are at the mercy of male wardens and guards, the horror stories are beyond belief of guards trading sexual favors for pads. And this is not rare. And it goes on still to this day, even though laws are passed. And that sounds very good. But as one attorney told me, it doesn't matter unless you get to the warden and talk to the warden and explain what access to period products means. It doesn't mean they're in the commissary where a lot of women in prison can't afford that. It means free. It means everywhere. It means just like toilet paper, which is probably also a problem in prison. So my big thing, what I want to tell everybody, when you go home, if you're not at home, when you please put out period products in the bathroom that your guests come in. It's like there's soap and water and toilet paper. There's a little bin or cup with a couple of pads and a couple of tampons so that people come and see that that's there. Whether or not anybody is ever going to use it, it's a sign that this is where it belongs, and it belongs everywhere. And it will get people talking too, which is good, or whispering, depending on your friends. So my speech.
Thank you. So Suzanne, when I was reading your book and reading your stories of training, and I trained in the same bad old days with that same schedule that we now regard as, unthinkable to inflict on anyone. And yet, I mean, do you have a sort of how we make the world better speech
Yes,
you want to make?
yes, absolutely. It's very simple. We need more women in positions of power and influence, period. End of sentence. So to speak. I mean, so here's what's going on in medicine, and I suspect in many other professions and industries. Our numbers are equalizing and even surpassing men at the lower levels. So, we're doing great in medical school and residency and at the assistant professor level. We're going nowhere at the levels of professor, dean, department chair. We're flatlined over the last 10, 15 years. And, so you could say, well, I mean, give it time, give it time. But there's been plenty of time. So there was a wonderful tweet by a young female physician just a couple of weeks ago. I think I can quote it directly. It's so good. She says, in 1993, when I was 8, I know, right? In 1993, when I was 8, 43% of entering medical students were women. Where are these women? And why aren't they my boss now?
Mm.
Great question. I mean, and what's the answer? The answer has to do with a few things, not least of which is inequity around childcare, prehistoric um, uh, maternal leave policies, the fact that in two-career couples where the woman is a physician, the women are still doing way more childcare and domestic work, yes, in 2021. And so something's got to give, and what usually gives is the woman's career advancement. Uh, there's also the issue in medicine, as in elsewhere, of harassment. 1 in 3 American female physicians report being harassed in some form at work, and 50% of those who report say they have no confidence that anything will be done about it because of the culture of medicine, which closes ranks and in which nobody wants to be the non-team player, the complainer, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very simple. Nothing is going to change until the women are the professors, the deans, the surgeons around the operating room.
I want to piggyback right on that the countries that have the most progressive menstrual policies right now, number one is Scotland, which is run by Ireland and New Zealand. And these 3 countries, Scotland recently went the furthest by mandating that period products be free in all public buildings that the state runs. It will take time for that to happen, but I don't think it's an accident that there's a woman at the top of that heap, that there's a woman prime minister in Ireland, and that terrific woman in New Zealand as well. So women in power make a difference. I think the reason that girls on campuses who are having success getting period products in campus bathrooms is because there are a lot more women in the administration than there have been before. So absolutely, you have to have women in power. It can't all go away just by us, waving flags and wearing cool t-shirts. We have to have power.
So I want to turn to a couple of the other questions coming from the audience. There's a question for you, Suzanne, from somebody who's a physician starting to do some narrative writing, trying to figure out issues about how to share stories coming from patients, asking, do you inform and collaborate with anyone whose story you relate, or do you endeavor to disguise?
Yeah. So there's 2 answers to this question. One is the legal answer, and then one is the ethical answer, and my own sort of personal sense of ethics around it. I'll just skip to the latter, which is that I would never publish anything, even disguised, in which someone could possibly recognize their own story in any form. without telling them in advance and getting their permission. If I can't get their permission, uh, uh, or if they're not long dead, then I either omit the story or I change it so completely that it could never be recognized. However, even when somebody is long dead, and by the way, you can't libel a dead person, but I still wouldn't write about someone who's died, without their family's permission. But even when somebody is long dead, because of the internet, it is amazing what can surface. I wrote a very complimentary newspaper column for the Boston Globe several years ago about a patient of mine who had died 15 years earlier, who had particular things to say about her extended family. You can't change a person's name when you write in the newspaper. You can in other places. So I used her real first name and I talked about her. And she died literally at age 95, 15 years earlier. And she had no family to speak of. And well, the next morning I got an email. I'm her cousin, and let me tell you the other side of the story. So, so I am very, very careful. Sometimes I have collaborated with patients and even co-written essays with patients, and a kind of fun experiment.
If we have time, I have one more question that came in for Anita, asking about people with difficult periods who are angry about this going on over time and how it can hold you back from progressing in the working world, and how painful cycles are dismissed sometimes even by the medical community. Is there anything more you'd like to say on that?
There needs to be more training than that graph that you talked about. And again, I think, more women physicians and more women teaching other physicians about taking this seriously, seeing menstruation as a vital sign. If you see it that way, it's more likely that you're going to find pathology, right? If you really see what's really normal on this curve, and if you have to, and you listen. I don't know how much more I can say about that. I think it's up to the physicians to get there. But I think the internet and talking to people, if you're in a lot of pain and you talk to people around you and they have experiences, this is how women have always taken care of themselves. You ask your neighbor, you ask your mother, you ask the person that you're working with, have you ever had this? Does this sound normal to you? And the more people who say no, and let me give you the name of somebody who will listen to you, that's sort of from the consumer point of view. You can't be quiet about it. You have to you have to learn to listen to your own body and take it seriously. And when you go to a doctor who says, you have to say, no, you're not listening to me. This is not normal. I know it's not normal. If you don't help me, I'm going to find another doctor. I mean, we all have to, I'm afraid we're still very much in that situation of having to advocate for ourselves, which is hard to do when you've got 5 minutes with a doctor who's in a rush, because it's not because her fault, because she's got to go to the next room. So it's a very complicated conundrum. And I'm so thrilled that both of you are on the other side of that, advocating for people to take more care of themselves as women physicians, and to listen to their female patients and to their menstruating patients with compassion.
I just say this, so here's a sign of progress. We'll end on a note of hope. A kind of snarky thing that doctors sometimes say, and I think there's a meme about this, is, your Google search, your Google search, doesn't overmatch my medical degree. Well, there's something going around on Twitter now. It's been shared many times by a young female doctor, I believe, who says, your Google search doesn't match my medical degree. It knows a lot more. So I think
humility.
Hopefully, we're developing a little more humility and compassion. And here's the little secret: is compassion for patients ends up being more compassion for ourselves. It really is a win-win.
So, oh, and here's Melanie.
I'm just here to say thank you to you all. This conversation really shows how important storytelling is in these areas, and life-saving it can be. So thank you all so much for joining us. Suzanne, Anita, I hope your books find their ways into the hands of many readers, and you can find a link in our chat to purchase the books from the Center for Fiction's bookstore. Perri, thank you so much for moderating tonight. I hope the four of us get to be in the same room someday in Brooklyn soon. And thank you all very much. And thanks to our audience for joining us.
Thanks so much, everyone.